blood flow has to increase. So basically, the determinants of the coronary blood flow's ultimate aim is that these factors should see to it that the oxygen supply to the myocardium is adequate. The other important factor here is that the oxygen extraction from the blood flow is somewhere around 70%, which is very high. That means with whatever amount of blood that is passing through the coronary blood flow, coronary vessels, the amount of oxygen extracted is somewhere around 70%. So 70% of oxygen is extracted from whatever is being supplied to it. So if there is an increase in the cardiac muscle activity, for example, in exercise, or if the heart rate increases for any reason, that means that the heart is beating faster. If the heart is beating faster, that means the systole and the diastole is increasing. That means the heart rate is increased, the systole is increased. If the systole is increased, for that increased muscle contraction, there needs to be an increased coronary blood supply, so that the oxygen supply is on par with the demand. So it is basically the demand supply ratio. If there is an increased demand because of the increased contractility of the cardiac muscle fibers, increased activity of the cardiac muscle fibers, the oxygen supply has to be compensated, and that increased oxygen supply is by causing increased coronary blood flow. Next, this is the balance which I was talking about. So, this is the oxygen supply, the cardiac muscle fire, the coronary blood flow depends upon two things, the myocardial oxygen supply and the myocardial oxygen demand. So, this ratio has to be maintained for a normal coronary blood flow. Normally, if you see here, this side we have the oxygen demand, this side we have the oxygen supply. If there is an increase in the metabolic rate, whatever the reason may be, the metabolic rate may be increased because of the increased heart rate, or it may be increased because of there is increased activity going on, that is there is an increased exercise happening. So whenever there is an increase in the heart rate or increase in the oxygen requirement of the heart, because as such which is seen in exercise, you will find that the oxygen demand has to increase. If the oxygen demand has increased, to supply this increased oxygen supply or demand, the oxygen supply has to increase. So that means the blood flow has to increase. So whenever there is an increased demand, there is an increased supply, and that happens through certain vasodilator substances. So exactly what is happening here is, where there is an increased requirement, increased oxygen demand because of the increased cardiac muscle activity, this causes the release of certain substances. These substances will cause vasodilatation. When there is a vasodilatation, there is an increased blood flow. When there is an increased blood flow, the coronary blood flow is increased. When the coronary blood flow is increased, that means there is an increased arterial oxygen content being supplied. So this increased supply will take care of this oxygen demand. Now at some point of time, we'll just discuss a minute here, if there is a decrease in the blood flow because of certain blockage of the heart. So if the coronary blood flow is decreased or some of the arteries are blocked, that means that there is a decreased oxygen supply to the fibers. If there is a decreased oxygen supply, that means there is decreased arterial oxygen content. When there is a decreased oxygen arterial content, that means this oxygen supply is not sufficient to meet the requirement, as a result of which it will result in hypoxia of the cardiac muscle fibers, and that will release certain abnormal substances, and those substances are lactic acid or adenosine, which will give rise to pain. So a decreased coronary blood flow, decreased oxygen supply causing release of certain vasodilator substances like adenosine and lactic acid. This lactic acid getting released into the circulation and causing pain. So the patient complains of chest pain. If during that supply, during that chest pain or during that episode when there is a hypoxia of the myocardium, if there is a vasodilatation and the blood supply is restored, the pain disappears. This we call it as an angina. Now why is that lactic acid released whenever there is a decreased coronary blood flow? This we will discuss little later. But for the time being, at this slide, you just remember that for a myocardial oxygen balance, the demand and the supply has to be proportionate. If there is an increased demand because of the increased cardiac activity. There are certain vasodilators released. The vasodilators will cause vasodilator substances like adenosine will be released. This will cause increase in the size of the arterioles. This will cause increased coronary blood flow. When there is increased coronary blood flow, that means that there is increased oxygen supply and that demand has to be met. If the demand is more and the supply is not happening, this will result in a mismatch and can result in pain. Now, what are the factors? Let us see what are the different factors which are affecting the coronary blood flow. I think this diagram will speak of it. You just remember this diagram and make a note of it. First, whenever there is an increase in the contractile activity. So what are the factors which are affecting the coronary blood flow? One of the factors which affects is the increased, whenever there is increased myocardial contractile activity, there is increased metabolism. When there is an increase in the metabolism, there is a decrease in the myocardial oxygen supply. When there is a decrease in the myocardial oxygen supply, there is a little bit of hypoxia taking place, and this hypoxia ultimately results in the release of certain substances which is known as adenosine. Now, to understand here how the increased metabolism causes release of adenosine, and sometimes it causes pain when there is an inadequate supply, you have to understand that the myocardial fibers or the muscle fibers usually under normal conditions get their energy from fatty acids. 70% of the oxygen supply is by means of energy derived by the metabolism of the free fatty acids. This cardiac muscle fiber uses free fatty acids as long as there is an adequate supply of oxygen to it. Now, if there is a decreased oxygen supply or the blood flow is reduced, maybe whatever reason, then the myocardial fibers will require anaerobic glycolysis. At that time, whenever there is this anaerobic glycolysis taking place, the ATP is that time at that moment supplied by means of the breakdown of glycogen and lactic acid. So there will be increased lactic acid production. This lactic acid production will give energy temporarily, and the release of lactic acid and a large amount of adenosine will cause chest pain because it will trigger the nerve fibers. But the lactic acid and the adenosine which is released will cause vasodilatation also, and when there is an increase in the diameter of these coronary blood vessels, this increased diameter will see that there is increased coronary blood flow and the oxygen supply is restored. Then apart from that, there are other factors which will also increase the coronary blood flow. First of all is the carbon dioxide. Whenever there is an increase in the PCO2 levels, the increased PCO2 levels will cause increase in the carbon dioxide, will cause vasodilatation of the coronary arterioles. Similarly, potassium ions. Potassium ions in low concentration will cause vasodilatation. If there is an increase in the potassium ion concentration, it will cause vasoconstriction. Similarly, calcium ions. The increased amount of calcium ions will act as a vasodilator. It will increase the blood flow and increase the oxygen supply. There are certain other substances also like bradykinin. The bradykinin, whenever it is present in the circulation, will cause vasodilatation. Another substance which causes vasoconstriction is angiotensin. Angiotensin, as you know, is a powerful vasoconstriction. This angiotensin, when is present in high concentration, is a very powerful vasoconstrictor of the arterioles, and whenever there is an increased concentration of angiotensin, it will cause vasoconstriction and decrease the coronary blood flow. Similarly, adenosine will cause vasodilatation and increase the blood flow. Then coming on to the sympathetic nerves, the sympathetic autonomic control, we know that there are autonomic nerves supplied to the coronary blood vessels. We have got sympathetic nerves and the parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic nerves and the parasympathetic supply is through the vagus nerve. The sympathetic nerves will release neurotransmitters like noradrenaline, whereas adrenal medulla also releases noradrenaline and adrenaline, whereas vagus nerves will cause release of acetylcholine. Let us briefly see what is the action of sympathetic nerves and what is the action of acetylcholine. When we see sympathetic nerves, the sympathetic nerves are acting by releasing non-adrenaline, and there are two types of receptors which are present. One is the alpha receptors and the other is the beta receptors. The alpha receptors when they are stimulated causes vasoconstriction, whereas when beta receptors are present they cause vasodilatation. So in other words, whenever there is a sympathetic stimulation, both the alpha receptors and the beta receptors will be stimulated. Alpha receptors will cause vasoconstriction, whereas beta receptors will cause vasodilatation. The next question is, where are the alpha receptors present in the heart and where are the beta receptors present? Remember one thing, the alpha receptors are the receptors which are present on the epicardial coronary arteries, whereas the beta receptors are the receptors which are present in those coronary blood vessels which are supplying into the muscle, that is directly into the cardiac muscle fibers and into the subendocardial capillaries. So therefore, whenever there is a sympathetic nerve, there will be a alpha receptor stimulation which will cause vasoconstriction of the coronary blood vessels which are present on the epicardium, whereas the same noradrenaline will bind on the beta receptors which is present in the intramyocardial arteries and in the subendocardial arteries, and it will cause vasodilatation. So the coronary vessels over the epicardium will get vasoconstricted, whereas the other vessels will get vasodilated. Overall, the effect will be something like a vasodilator effect. Coming on to the other part of it, we also know that the sympathetic nerves which are supplying to the heart has got two effects. One, it increases the heart rate and it increases the force of contraction. When the heart rate is increased or when the force of contraction is increased, that means that the cardiac muscle activity is increased. Whenever there is an increased cardiac muscle activity, that means there is an increased requirement of oxygen to the muscles. So at that time, because there is an increased requirement of oxygen because of the local activity taking place, there will also be a increased metabolic factors, local level increase. So adenosine will be released, and this adenosine will cause vasodilatation and will increase the coronary blood flow. So therefore, sympathetic nerves will have got a dual effect. One, a direct effect on the alpha receptors and the beta receptors, where alpha receptors vasoconstriction, beta receptors vasodilatation, whereas sympathetic activity, because on the overall action of the heart, an indirect effect where it increases the heart rate, increases the force of contraction. This causes increased muscle activity, cardiac muscle activity. Increased cardiac muscle activity means increased release of metabolite adenosine. Increased adenosine may cause vasodilatation and increase the blood flow. So also the similar effect is seen on the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is a parasympathetic nerve. There are dual effects on it. When the vagus nerve is actually stimulated, it acts on the conducting system of the heart and slows down the heart rate. When it causes the slowing down of the heart rate, that means there is a decreased activity of the heart. So what activity, how much oxygen requirement would have been there when the heart rate would have been 70 to 80 per minute. But because of vagal stimulation, if it comes down to 60 per minute, the myocardial heart rate, the heart rate is reduced, the myocardial activity is reduced, so the oxygen requirement is reduced, the coronary blood flow is reduced. But we also know that the vagus nerve releases a neurotransmitter which is called as acetylcholine. through its acetylcholine action, it causes vasodilatation. Then there are other effects also like thyrotoxicosis. Whenever there is an increase in the thyroid activity, thyroid levels in the body, it increases the BMR. When the BMR is increased, the activity of the myocardium is increased. Also, the increased thyroxine levels, as you see in thyrotoxicosis, will cause increase in the heart rate. When there is an increase in the heart rate, there is increased requirement of coronary blood flow. So, there will be increased coronary circulation in thyrotoxicosis. Similarly, during exercise, when a person is doing exercise, there is an increase in the coronary blood flow. Then, in fever, whenever there is a fever or the body temperature is raised, the increased body temperature raises the basal metabolic rate. When the basal metabolic rate is increased, then there will be an increase in the coronary blood flow. Then two other important factors which affect the coronary blood flow is, one is the prostaglandins and the other is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, as you would have seen in local regulation of blood flow, one of the factors which causes a very powerful vasodilator effect is nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a very powerful vasodilator of the coronary vessels. So whenever there is an increased release of nitric oxide, it causes vasodilatation. Similarly, prostaglandins, whenever there is an increased secretion of prostaglandins, release of prostaglandins, it will cause increase in the coronary blood flow. So these are some of the factors which are affecting the coronary blood flow. Next, another factor which affects the coronary blood flow is the phasic blood flow. One of the characteristic feature of the coronary circulation is the phasic circulation, is the phasic determinant of the coronary blood flow. So what do you say, what do you mean by phasic flow to the heart? That means that the whole of the cardiac cycle is divided into two phases. One is the systole and the other is the diastole. The systole is somewhere around 0.5 seconds, 0.3 seconds, the diastole is around 0.5 seconds. So now the coronary blood flow is different during the systole and is different during the diastole. Now when you see this, in systole you will find that the coronary blood flow is slightly reduced and by the end of the systole it comparatively falls down. Whereas during the diastole you will find that the coronary blood flow is increased. How do you explain this phasic flow of the coronary circulation? Three factors are there. One I said is the aortic blood pressure is one of the most important determinant of the coronary circulation. See here, during systole you will find that the aortic blood pressure is increasing. But simultaneously, during the same systole, when there is increase in this aortic pressure, you also will find that in the first half of the systole, the coronary circulation literally remains the same, but in the later half, there is a fall of the coronary blood flow. Whereas in diastole, when the aortic pressure is coming down, you will find that the coronary circulation is increasing. Now, how do you explain this? For this, you have to go back to your physiologic anatomy of the first slide which I had shown you. And if you see that, you will find that the coronary blood flow is basically the vessels are passing through the muscle, through the myocardium and then entering into the subendocardial plexus. Now during systole, what happens? All of the muscle cardiac fibers are contracting. When they are contracting, that is during the systolic phase, there is a compression of the capillaries as the myocardium is contracting. That means the coronary vessels are getting squeezed or compressed when the heart is in systole. As a result of which, there is a sudden cut-off of blood supply and the coronary circulation to the muscle mass, to the myocardium is reduced. Whereas in diastole, the reverse happens. In diastole, the cardiac muscle fibers are in relaxation. the muscle is relaxing, the squeeze or the compression on the coronary blood flow is released, the coronary vessels are coming back to the normal size, as a result of which you will find that the blood flow during the diastole is increased. So there is a phasic blood flow in the coronary vessels. In systole it falls down, whereas in diastole it increases. Again, you can divide this diastole into the isometric relaxation phase, then you can call that the first rapid filling phase, then you can have the second phase, and this is the third rapid filling phase. So in this way you will find that there is a phasic coronary variation in the blood flow. Now the last feature of the coronary circulation is that it has got excellent collateral circulation. Any one vessel gets blocked, or suppose the end arteries are getting blocked, there is a collateral circulation developing from the surrounding capillaries or the surrounding arterioles and restoring the blood supply. In this way, the nature sees to it that whenever a little portion of the myocardial fibers is running short of any blood flow, then the collaterals start developing, and these collaterals help in restoring the circulation back to normal. So some of the features which we have discussed today is coronary blood flows are the most important source of oxygen supply to the myocardium. Second, 70% of the oxygen extraction takes place among the coronary blood flow, among the coronary circulation. In this, the coronary circulation is somewhere around 225 ml per minute. There are very many determinants of coronary blood flow, the prominent among them being the vasodilators, especially the adenosine, the nitric oxide and the prostaglandins. Also, the coronary circulation depends upon the myocardial activity. An increase in the myocardial activity will cause an increase in the release of vasodilator substances, which will increase the coronary blood flow. And lastly, there is an excellent collateral circulation. Apart from this, there is another important feature, which is that the phasic flow. That means during systole, the coronary blood flow is coming down drastically, whereas in diastole, the coronary circulation is restored fully back to normal. So a phasic coronary circulation is the characteristic feature. Thank you. We shall discuss about the pathophysiological changes, that is ischemic heart disease, in the next session, that is after we complete the cardiovascular system. We will be discussing few topics under integrated physiology. There in integrated physiology, I will talk about ischemic heart diseases. Thank you.